Okay, so first talk is Michael Cox on computational metacognition. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Tom. First of all, I'd like to thank National Science Foundation and the Office of Naval Research for funding portions of this work. I'd like to thank my master's student, Mohammad, who programmed the domain and much of what you'll see today, but also Sravya Kondrakunta and Sampath Gogineni, who are my PhD students, have worked on this as well, and my colleagues at Parallax Advanced Research, Dustin, Dannenhauer, and Othalia, Larue. I've actually been also wanting to mention a quick shout out to Paul Bello, who 10 years ago funded this work on the MIDCA framework and architecture that I'll talk about today with only some ideas. And so it's been a long time that I've been working on this, and it's actually only now that we've gotten the full 2 cycles in this architecture working, especially at the meta level. I mean, it's very hard to do this kind of work. You not only have to get the domain right, some kind of simulator perhaps, you need to get cognition correct and in a refined way. And then only then can you really do metacognition and get that right. So there's a lot of parts to that, but we do now have the meta level cycle working in full, even though you'll see today to be a pretty simple set of examples. But we've got a lot of work ahead of us still. So let's see if I can move. Okay, there we go. So there's a very simple model of computational metacognition that, along with Anita Raja, we developed a simple model back in 2011, actually a little bit before that. And the idea is that you have an agent that is doing perception and choosing actions. There's the ground level where things get done. You have perceptions emanate from the world, and you do actions and execute that at the ground level. Object level is where you're doing reasoning. You're actually choosing actions. You're interpreting your perceptions. So like an action perception agent, you can think of meta reasoning or metacognition in a very similar way. There's introspective monitoring of some representation of the object level, of the reasoning of the system. And then you can do some meta level choices to choose some kind of a control action that will change reasoning and indirectly change your performance. I'll also want to color code this. You'll see why later. I think of the metacognition in blue and the rest in orange. So we'll come back to that. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of people have worked in metacognition, both in psychology, in human metacognition, in machines, and there's been work done for a long time. And a lot of things come under this umbrella. I, however, think of it in three classes of metacognition. And I'll call those explanatory metacognition, immediate metacognition, and anticipatory metacognition. Explanatory is reasoning about your own reasoning and errors that you might have made in the past. You have some expectations about what will be happening in your reasoning, and when your reasoning doesn't go correctly, you have this hindsight in which you can choose to learn something new or change your reasoning after this retrospective analysis. Immediate metacognition, I think of that as similar to eye-hand coordination. As I reach for a glass, there's actually two phases. One that's pretty fast. As your hand gets close to the glass, though, you actually slow down. It's imperceptible, and you get some feedback, and you'll adjust as it occurs in the present. So there's, and we have not done that. It's for future research, and people that have, for instance, Russell and Wefall had this idea of anytime planning, and you reason about the planning and whether or not you have a good enough plan yet, or should I continue planning? That would be an example. Horowitz's work was also from a while back. Another kind is anticipatory. This is thinking about the reasoning in the future and predicting that I'm going to have some kind of problem and having some kind of intervention ahead of time. Actually, Sampath Gogineni in my lab is working with goal delegation in a multi-agent system, and he uses this kind of anticipatory metacognition to have some reasoning about how the cognition will occur in the future. What I'll talk about today is the first category, this explanatory metacognition. So we'll first start to go through some basic formalisms to make this concrete in a formal way. We'll take a look at the metacognitive integrated dual cycle architecture, MIDCA, and then we'll have a concrete example in a plant protection domain that we borrowed from the Naval Research Lab. We'll take a look very briefly at a couple experiments in this domain, and I'll have brief comments as the conclusion. So first of all, let's think about an expectation, a normal expectation in the world. When I do an action, I have an expected state that will result afterwards, and then I have an actual state, that's the current state that I observe. So when my observations do not coincide with my expectations, there's a violation. And in the goal reasoning work at the cognitive level, we actually want to explain this kind of discrepancy and generate new goals on the fly to be able to handle when you have expectation failures in the normal sense. And we'll see that in an example later. A metacognitive expectation failure is a little different. We have these mental states, and I'll have them little s with a superscript m as our mental states. There'll be some kind of vector of variables, and we'll get particular with what's the content of these later on. And then a mental action, alpha, is one of your cognitive processes. You can think of it as that. So a metacognitive expectation then is simply a triple. It's a mental state followed by a mental action and then some resulting mental state. And we'll again make that concrete, but a possible example is that you could have in your memory a current goal, G sub C, that you're going to plan for and try to generate some sequence of actions that might achieve it. You then do the planning, and afterwards there should be some plan, which here we'll just have as pi, which is part of the mental state. If that doesn't occur, then maybe my planning is incorrect. Perhaps I might want to switch from case-based planning to HTN planning if it was computational. In any case, that's the idea. And over a trace of reasoning, we want to be able to think about our expectations in the object level and what goes wrong, and then how we can manage those in hindsight. So the kinds of responses, the meta-level goal, G sub C with the superscript M, could be to change our reasoning method, could be to change the goals. Perhaps I'm playing chess, I might change from checkmate to draw might be the goal, given the outcome of that has happened so far in the game. And finally, we might have a goal to learn a specific piece of information, or acquire some information, or modify and adapt the actions, the action model, for instance. In fact, we'll talk about that and focus on learning goals as we go through this today. We borrowed formalism that's notation used in the planning community, and we have there a state transition, sigma, which is the set of all possible states, capital S, all possible actions, A, in a function gamma, which represents a successor function. This function takes a particular state in an action and then predicts what the subsequent state would be. A problem solution itself is pi. It's a sequence of actions, alpha 1 through n, and we can also have it in a similar to array notation, have a subsequence. Here we have Alpha 1 is the head, the tail is the subsequence 2 through n. Now, plan execution can be represented with gamma. We have from the initial state S0 and the first action, we come up with S1, which is then applied again to the remainder of the plan. Iteratively, you will get to a final state S of G, which should entail the goal. And I say entail rather than it's a subset because the goal, for instance, could be abstract. I want some block on block A. And so there could be many states that would entail that expression, goal expression. So in a similar way, at the metacognitive level, we have a self model, capital Omega. And here we have the states, in meta level mental states, the actions, mental actions, and then a cognitive transition function, lowercase omega. This, like the previous one we saw, gamma, is a successor function that would take a mental state and a mental action and predict what the mental state would be after that. So a cognitive trace that we want to represent is very simple. It's just a sequence of mental states followed by mental action, the subsequent mental state, action, and so forth. We want to be able to reason over those traces. So making this a little bit more specific, we have the MIDCA that I had mentioned, we've been working on for a decade now, metacognitive integrated dual cycle architecture. And there are two cycles in this. One in blue is the metal cycle. There's also then the cognitive level is in orange here. So there's, you can see actions and perceptions at the ground level, the problem solving and comprehensions at the object level, and then the whole cycle is composed of introspective monitoring and meta level control is the top metacognitive level that we'll focus on today. But first of all, I'd like to look a little bit at the cognitive level. So we might have a set of goals at the top of this, and the agenda is capital G's hat. The intend phase in this cycle would pick some subset of goals, G sub C, from the agenda. Plan would then come up with pi sub K, a plan that would achieve those goals when executed, and then executes an action one at a time. You perceive then, percept, and induce a state or infer the state from those percepts that was the state of the world after the action. You interpret that with respect to the plan and evaluate it with respect to the current goals, and whether you're finished or not, and you can iterate. I'm just going to point out that interpret, we've actually done a lot of work in this phase, and I've had papers we've talked about in the past. Here's where our goal reasoning is. One of the more novel things in our architecture, we look for discrepancies between the observed and expected states. When we see a discrepancy, in that discrepancy we judge to be a problem, we want to generate some kind of a self-explanation or diagnosis of what caused that problem and formulate a new goal, G sub n, that would then, if achieved, solve that problem. And you add that to the goal agenda. In a very similar way, we have the same 6 phases at the meta level. Here, let's start on the right with monitor. So you would take tau is that trace that we looked at before, sequence of mental states, mental action, mental states, and we'll look at portions of that. We'll interpret it. If we see a metacognitive expectation failure, we want to then explain what caused that, what caused the reasoning at the cognitive level to go wrong, and generate some meta level goal, perhaps a learning goal, for example, to mitigate that problem. We evaluate whether or not the meta level goals that are current are finished, and we then go to intend, which picks a subset. If we have finished the last one, picks a subset of the goals that we have in the meta level agenda. We generate some plan for that, and then run that plan. Now I think of these as algorithms. Maybe I would have a learning algorithm that I'm actually going to run to change the knowledge that's then used by the cognitive level. Maybe I'll change the goals that then changes cognition. I'd mentioned there are three basic ways, three different types of meta-level goals that could be used to change the reasoning at the lower level. I am going to also finally mention that this meta-level cycle is run after each phase is run in the cycle before. So if I do plan at the cognitive level, I'll run a whole cycle here and see if I can detect something wrong that went with that planning step. Okay. So I'm going to mention a domain that we borrowed from NRL that is this plant protection domain. There are different plants in the garden. We have native plants that we want to preserve and invasive ones that we wish were dead. And we can have goals for both, preserve native plants and kill the invasive ones in the garden. Now, different actions exist. We have move to go to different places in the garden. We have a spray to spray your herbicide, and we can communicate with a human or other agents on the results of our actions. Here's an example that is very simple. In the middle, we have the white part is the garden, and then there's a walkway around it. The agent's at 0, 0, the little robot down there. And there's two invasive plants in the garden. One's at 3, 2, the other one's at 2, 5, and we have a native plant at 3, 3. So the plan could be to go to 3, 2, spray the herbicide, go to 2, 5, spray the herbicide, and complete. That will kill the plants in the invasive, in those two invasive plants. However, our model of the action for spray could be incorrect. We might think that it's only going to kill a plant where we spray it, but perhaps it kills any plant adjacent to that cell. Now, if that was the case, you can see here that when I spray at 3, 2, I'm actually going to kill that plant at 3, 3. And this is going to cause a normal expectation failure. And this one's a little special for us. We call it goal expectation. We expect that when we achieve a goal, or in this case, it's already true in the initial state, if it all of a sudden becomes not true or not satisfied, that then causes an expectation failure, a normal one. We might actually explain that maybe we observed some other gardener that was spraying in 3, 3 at the same time when we were spraying at 3, 2, and that was what caused that plant to die. And we might generate a goal to intervene with that gardener and tell him that's the wrong kind of plant to kill. But if we don't observe it, well, what do we do? So I said I'd be a little bit more specific with what a mental state action in some of these things are. And here we have mental state as a 7 tuple. And G sub C is the current goal, the goal agenda, G hat, the current plan, pi, our current interpretation of the state of the world, M sub phi, the set of discrepancies, explanations, and then the current step that was just executed, alpha of I. The mental actions here are what you see in the set ACE with superscript M. So it's perceive, and then within interpret, there are 3 subphases: detect the discrepancies, explain, what we call goal insertion, which is to formulate a new goal. And then we have evaluate, intend, planned, and act. And so those are the different labels that we're using for the mental action. And then in this case, we have another metacognitive expectation. There might have been a discrepancy right before we tried to explain it. For instance, why did that plant die when I sprayed in the cell adjacent to it? And I should have an explanation after I try to explain it. If I can't come up with an explanation, for instance, I did not observe another gardener do anything? Well, maybe my model of how spray works is incorrect. I might want to generate the learning goal, learn spray in the next state. And we actually have used, let's see, do I want to, right. I can, again, take a look at the meta level. When we come with
5
this.
minutes, Michael.
5 minutes, fine, okay. So we have interpret generates this learning goal. We actually have a planner that's fast downward that we have, I have backup slides to show it. We have a PDDL representation of doing the planning. Control could then call FOIL, which is what we do. FOIL learns a horn clause, which I won't exactly go through, but it says that if you spray at a certain position at a certain time, and then right north of it, it's as if you sprayed north of it. That was in the example. And then you need to map that to the conditional effects in the operator. And iteratively, as you make mistakes, you'll learn a complete operator. We have an agent that does none of this, that just plain learns and tries to generate and spray willy-nilly. And then the agent I just talked about, we randomly put plants out there. We keep the ratio of invasive, native to invasive constant. In one set of experiments, it's 75-25, the other 60-40. We have goals range from either 1 to 20, and we have 100 at each. So that's 200 per experiment. This is just the result. In the 75-25, the lower one, and this is the percentage of goals achieved on the y-axis. And then the number of goals per problem, you can think of that, the more goals, the more complex the problem is. As problems get more complex, performance is reduced in terms of the percentage of goals achieved, but you can see that learning does better, this metacognitive agent, and it stays the same in the 60-40 as well. I did want to mention this code's available open source, and I invite you to look at the paper. There's actually a lot that I didn't talk about. It's quite complicated to manage both of these. And we're still in the preliminary stages. Our plans are single step plans. We're doing very simple learning right now, but I think previous results that we've had at the cognitive level and the state of the art in the planning community gives us hope that we can scale this up to much more complex problems. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike. Are there some questions? Let me check the Slack for a second here. Okay, I don't see anything on Slack.
Yes, there is, Tom.
There
There's
is.
3 questions.
Oh, well, my Slack foo is hurting here.
You're a slacker.
Yeah.
I can just ask my question. This is
Please,
Bob.
go ahead.
Mike, this is great. I really enjoyed this talk. I just wanted to ask whether you had a strong commitment to metacognition being focused on error correction. I think most of your examples had that flavor to them, and the signal had that flavor.
Yep.
But it seems like metacognition is broader than that. So I was wondering if you could just say about that, and if you had ideas what triggers for metacognition in the MIDCA framework might be other than errors.
Yep. Thanks. This is Bob Ray.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So my work has, since my thesis work, actually focused on this kind of self-diagnosis, having errors drive it. In fact, back in the 90s, wrote a paper that argued that if an error occurs, there is guaranteed to have something worth learning, whereas under success, there may or may not. Now, this anticipatory metacognition that I talk about briefly in the paper and just brushed over in this talk is not triggered by errors of reasoning. Instead, it predicts errors in the future by looking at things like suspended goals and actual physical resources that are present. And in the goal reasoning workshop, Gogineni authored a paper that starts to talk about that in a little bit more detail. And I think that is still early, but I do not, yeah, I think certainly triggers are not only limited to errors.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next?
Brett? If there's no Brett, then I'll talk. So Mike, this is Pat Langley. So humans exhibit metacognition some of the time, but when they become really very well practiced in some domain, they lose access to a lot of those intermediate results, and they're not even aware of how they did something. Now, I mean, that clearly has some advantages for people who have limited memory. It's not clear if you need that in your system, but if you were going to incorporate it, how would you go about it?
So the automate, like compiling knowledge into, so right, is that really metacognitive?
No, not the process of compiling, but the fact that the system can compile things, and then once it does it, it runs more efficiently, but it can no longer engage in metacognition over traces of that compiled procedure.
Right. Yeah, I haven't really thought about that. I know there's some aspects in human metacognition, like feelings of knowing, feelings of rightness. I think there's where I have some confidence. I mean, just in my own work in grad school, I remember I was in calculus, I would be doing a problem and I could at some point feel like, oh, I'm on the right track versus I'm lost. And this is just, it's not, my thinking is not working right. Now, once I become so much of a calculus expert, perhaps, or a mathematician, if that was the direction I was taking, maybe I will lose that and don't really think as much about that, but I'm not sure. That's a good question.
I got you, but I'm talking about losing the ability to say what your intermediate goals were, because you don't actually have the goals. You're just doing it.
Okay. So no, that's
but that trait, the cognitive trait, is not even laid down anymore.
Right. So that's interesting. But so right now we're just starting. We might as well think of MIDCA as a novice, or even, yeah. And that's a good question. Or why you might have in something simple as that, maybe metacognition would be applied over things at a higher granularity instead of individual cognitive steps.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There's always a level at which there will be a trace. But below that, you may lose access to it. And that may be a price you're willing to pay in order to become more efficient, if you're confident enough with those skills.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I've got a really good answer for it.
I have a quick follow-up. Just, Mike, do you think there should be an action where you can decide what to add in the trace and what to remove from the trace as a metacognitive action?
Yeah, I have thought about it as not something that you would have access to, or control over. I just think the more you load up on the metacognitive side, the less tractable it's going to get to be. And that, and there's no level above the meta level. I think I've had that one before. Just, it becomes, you have this tower of steps to a higher level. You just, you're going to get intractable. It's already, there's a large overhead. I think I am interested in developing, though, a means of being able to know when I should do metacognition, when I shouldn't. When should I not jump to the meta level? Because perhaps there's a time limit, and the problems in reasoning that I'm encountering are not serious. If I have some way to suppress metacognition or spend more time thinking, that I think is interesting, and be interesting research to better understand when metacognition is a win and when is it not computationally worth it.